I remember those mornings like they were carved into my memory with sunlight. The golden light would pour through our kitchen window, dust motes dancing in the air as if they were tiny fairies celebrating the start of the day. My toys were always scattered across the living room floor, blocks in uneven towers, stuffed animals leaning against the sofa as though they'd been caught mid-adventure. I would sit among them, sipping a small glass of milk, feeling safe in the rhythm of our home. My parents moved around the kitchen, voices low but warm, laughter occasionally spilling out over the counter. It was ordinary, mundane even, but to me, it felt like the entire universe. That I was small, of course, just a child learning the rules of the world one scraped knee at a time. I felt loved, or at least I thought I did. My parents smiled when I followed instructions, praised me when I did as I was told, and frowned when I didn't. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I didn't notice how quick their approval could vanish, or how fast the warmth of the room could turn into tension if I stepped out of line. It was subtle, like a shadow stretching across a sunlit floor. You only see it if you're looking closely. I played, I imagined. I ran barefoot across the kitchen tiles, feeling the coolness bite at my skin, and yet a tiny, persistent unease would sometimes curl in my chest. Nothing overt, nothing my young mind could fully articulate. Just a whisper that maybe, just maybe, the safety I felt was conditional. I always thought saying no was okay, wasn't it? I would ask myself in those quiet moments, though. The question never reached anyone else. It lingered inside me like the faint smell of toast from breakfast, there, but easily ignored. I didn't yet know that one day, that simple word, no, would change everything. Even now, thinking back, I can almost hear the echoes of that laughter, smell the warm butter on bread, and feel the sun on my back. There was love in those rooms. Undeniably so, but it was a love that required compliance, and I wouldn't realize the weight of that until much later. For now, I was just a child, wrapped in a blanket of normalcy. Unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing outside the walls of my little world. I still remember the day as if it were etched into my bones, the way the sunlight felt harsher. That afternoon, slicing through the window and highlighting every dust particle floating lazily in the air. I was 7, maybe 8, sitting at the kitchen table with a homework assignment spread out in front of me. My parents were busy preparing dinner, chopping vegetables, and humming along to a faint radio tune. I had spent the morning trying to explain why I didn't want to participate in the weekend trip they'd planned. A trip I had no interest in, no excitement for, and, truthfully, just wanted to spend quietly in my own little world. I don't want to go, I said softly, trying to sound reasonable, my small hands clasped together on the table. For a moment, everything froze. The knife stopped mid-chop. The radio seemed to hum louder in my ears, and my parents' eyes turned toward me with a sharpness I wasn't ready for. It wasn't just disappointment or annoyance. It was shock, almost like I had said something forbidden, something unthinkable. "What did you just say?" my mother asked, voice tight, eyes narrowing. I tried to explain again, carefully, calmly, the way I'd seen other adults do in arguments. I don't want to go. I'm tired. I want to stay home." But those words, innocent as they were, seemed to crack the air between us. My father's hand froze on the counter, the knife glinting in the fading light. "You will go because we said so," he said, the calmness in his voice more frightening than anger could ever have been. The room, once warm and safe, felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in. I remember my stomach dropping, a cold, hollow weight that made my chest ache. I wanted to retreat, to vanish under the table and disappear into the wooden floorboards. But I stayed, frozen. That I didn't understand it then. I just knew that something had shifted. The love, the laughter, the sunlit kitchen, all of it had tilted, as though the gravity of my own choice had thrown the room off balance. And in that moment, I realized, with a growing, sinking certainty, that saying no, something I thought was harmless, natural, human, wasn't just wrong to them. It was unacceptable. I remember staring at my small hands, wishing they could vanish, wishing my voice could disappear, and feeling the first, piercing sting of betrayal. That day, I learned that obedience mattered more than me, more than my feelings, more than anything. And I didn't know it yet. But that simple refusal would become the first fracture in the life I thought was safe, the first crack in a world I had taken for granted I can still feel the cold that seeped into the house that evening, though the winter had long passed from the calendar. The kitchen, once filled with warmth and light, felt hollow, the laughter replaced by silence that pressed against my ears. My parents didn't scream, didn't raise their voices, they just left. Not in a sudden, dramatic way that I could rationalize, but in a slow, deliberate withdrawal. Doors closed quietly behind them, footsteps fading down the hall, and I was left sitting at the edge of the sofa, staring at the empty space where their presence had always been that I remember trying to call out, my voice small and trembling. "Wait, where are you going?" But no answer came, just the echo of my own words bouncing off the walls, like the house itself was mocking me. My tiny hands gripped the edge of the sofa as tears filled my eyes, and for the first time, I understood what it truly meant to be abandoned. The air smelled faintly of the soup they'd been making, tomatoes, onions, something comforting I couldn't taste anymore because the comfort had vanished with them. There were no words of explanation, no apology, no sign that this was temporary. I remember trying to make sense of it, reasoning like a child always does. Maybe they were angry. Maybe I'd done something wrong. But deep down, an unbearable truth was settling in. This wasn't about a mistake or a tantrum. This was final. My world had shifted in a way that I couldn't undo. I crawled to my bedroom. The wooden floor cold beneath my knees, and curled up under my blanket, clinging to the faint scent of my mother's perfume that lingered in the room. I pressed my small hands over my ears, trying to shut out the quiet, and for hours, I whispered promises to myself. They'll come back. They have to. They can't just leave me. But as night fell and the house remained empty, the realization sank deeper, like ice spreading through my chest. Flashbacks hit me in sharp, bitter waves, small memories of their smiles, the times they held my hand, the moments they said they loved me. And yet, each memory felt like a cruel reminder that those moments weren't enough to anchor them to me when I needed them most. That night, I understood something no child should ever have to grasp. Love without consistency, love conditional on obedience, wasn't enough to keep me safe. And for the first time, I felt truly, achingly alone. The first months without them felt endless, like walking through a fog that refused to lift. The house echoed with emptiness. Even the walls seemed to mourn my solitude. I learned quickly that survival wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, quiet acts. Making my own meals, keeping my clothes clean, finding warmth in a bed that no longer smelled of comfort. I discovered the rhythm of self-reliance, the way it felt to pour cereal into a bowl for one, to brush my teeth in a silent bathroom, to whisper reassurances to myself that I was going to be okay, even when every fiber of my being screamed that. I started noticing details I'd taken for granted before. The way the sunlight pooled differently in each room, the sound of rain tapping on the window like it was trying to remind me the world was still moving, still alive, even if I felt frozen in place. I found solace in the small victories, tying my shoes without help, finishing a homework assignment alone, figuring out how to cook a simple meal without burning it. Each accomplishment, no matter how tiny, became a lifeline. Flashbacks of kindness cropped up in the most unexpected ways. Mrs. Patel, my neighbor, who slipped me cookies and whispered, "You're stronger than you know," became a quiet reminder that the world wasn't entirely cruel. My teacher, Mr. Ahmed, who noticed the quiet boy at the back of the class and offered extra help without asking for anything in return, taught me that some people genuinely cared. Those moments stitched together a fragile sense of trust and humanity, filling in the gaping hole left by my parents' absence. But alongside resilience was always a shadow, a quiet, simmering ache. Every evening, as the house grew dark and the silence thickened, I would curl up in my bed and imagine them returning, imagining the door swinging open with warmth, apologies, hugs. I knew deep down it wasn't coming, yet hope refused to die completely. And so I learned to balance it. Hope for the impossible, strength for the necessary, and patience for the lonely journey of growing up too fast. That I also learned the value of observation. I watched people, studied their reactions, and realized the power of self-preservation. I learned to read the subtle shifts in tone, the flicker of disapproval, the silent warnings that some words or actions could cost more than they were worth. And slowly, I transformed. The scared, abandoned child in the sunlit kitchen evolved into someone who could navigate the world on their own terms. Someone who could survive without the anchors I had lost too early to be by the time I hit my teenage years. The ache of abandonment had morphed into a quiet, simmering anger that I carried everywhere. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no outbursts, no confrontations, but it lingered in the edges of my thoughts, a shadow following me through every school hallway, every crowded street, every reflection in a shop window. I would watch other kids laughing with their parents, their voices mingling over dinners and phone calls, and feel a hollow twist in my chest. It was the unfairness of it all, the gnawing sense that I had been left behind for a reason I could never fully understand. That I built walls around myself, not out of malice, but self-preservation. Trust became a currency I spent only when absolutely necessary. I studied people carefully, noting the slight twitch of an eyebrow, the way a smile faltered just before truth spilled out. I became a student of human behavior, learning early that emotions were tools, either to protect myself or to keep others at a safe distance. Yet, even in that armor, I couldn't entirely escape the bitterness. Sometimes, late at night, I would whisper into the dark, "Why me? What did I ever do to deserve being left alone?" And no answer ever came. Flashbacks hit with sharp clarity. I remembered birthdays where the house remained quiet, Christmas mornings spent wrapping gifts for imaginary guests, and afternoons watching my friends play in yards where I should have been included. These memories were like cracks in my carefully built walls, moments where resentment and longing collided, leaving me unsure whether I was angry, sad, or both at once. I wanted to hate them fully, to despise the people who had abandoned me, but a stubborn part of me still remembered their laughter, their voices, the fleeting warmth that once existed. That contradiction haunted me, yet resentment wasn't entirely destructive. It became a fuel, driving me toward independence, toward proving that I could succeed without their approval. I excelled in school, stayed up late studying, took every opportunity one could, not to spite them, but to reclaim the pieces of myself I had been denied. Visualizing their absence in my achievements, I sometimes imagined the look on their faces had they returned to see me thriving. It was a bitter, almost vengeful thought, but it reminded me that I had agency, that I could define my worth despite their rejection. Through all of this, I learned to live in tension, between anger and longing, between hurt and determination. That shadow of resentment, while heavy, became strangely protective. It reminded me who I was, what I had endured, and what I refused to allow anyone, including my parents, to take from me again. And somewhere in the murky space between anger and love, I started to understand that I could survive, and maybe even thrive, without the people who should have been my anchors. By the time I reached adulthood, the resentment that had shadowed my teenage years had transformed into something more focused, a quiet, relentless drive to break through the limitations my childhood had imposed. I threw myself into work, into studies, into every opportunity that came my way, as if each achievement could stitch together the pieces of a life that had been left incomplete. Early mornings blurred into late nights. The sound of my alarm became the pulse of ambition, and the city outside my window was both a challenge and a promise, offering the chance to carve out a life entirely of my own. Making that I remember the first paycheck I earned on my own. Holding that paper in my hands, feeling the crispness of it, the tangible proof of my effort, I felt a surge of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: pride. It was mine. Not a gift, not conditional, not a fleeting approval. It was mine. I would repeat this feeling often in my mind, reminding myself that I didn't need anyone else's validation to feel accomplished. Visual cues became landmarks of my progress. The first small apartment I could call my own, the smell of coffee in the mornings before anyone else stirred, the faint hum of the city that felt like it was cheering me on. Flashbacks would occasionally strike, unbidden, carrying both pain and motivation. I remembered those cold, lonely nights, the hollow kitchens, the silence that had once swallowed me whole. But now, those memories fueled me rather than crushed me. I imagined a future where I could rise above that abandonment, where the echoes of neglect were replaced with the sound of my own triumph. I began to invest in myself, learning skills, building networks, and crafting a path toward a life I had never dared to dream of as a child. There were moments of vulnerability, too, when the walls I had built around my emotions felt heavier than usual. Sometimes, I'd lie awake in a quiet room, listening to my own breathing, wondering if I had lost too much to make up for. But each time, I reminded myself of the resilience I had cultivated, the lessons of survival, and the undeniable proof that I could succeed independently. Every milestone, every promotion, every achievement, every opportunity seized was a step away from the child who had once sat alone, waiting for love that never came. And then came the day when I realized the life I had built wasn't just survival, it was flourishing. I had reached a point where financial security, professional respect, and personal fulfillment were no longer distant dreams, but realities. I had broken through, not just the limitations of my past, but the invisible chains of abandonment. I had proven, silently but undeniably, that my worth was not determined by those who had once left me behind. I was whole, despite them. It happened so suddenly that my heart almost tripped over itself. I had just stepped off my private jet, the hum of the engines fading behind me, the city lights stretching like a glittering river beneath the tarmac. The evening air smelled faintly of asphalt and jet fuel, mixed with the distant aroma of street food. I was focused on my usual routine, checking schedules, confirming meetings, but then I saw them. My parents, after 20 years, standing near the entrance, faces older, lines etched deep, but unmistakably them. For a moment, time fractured. Their expressions were frozen in disbelief, almost as though they had stumbled into a memory they hadn't believed real. My mind scrambled, trying to reconcile the faces of the people who had abandoned me with the undeniable reality that they were here, staring up at the same jet I had just exited. I could hear the distant chatter of staff in the city below, but all of it seemed muted, irrelevant, swallowed by the sudden, overwhelming flood of emotions. I froze, unsure whether to approach, to speak, to acknowledge them, or to turn and vanish into the safety I had spent years building. My hands tightened around the leather of my luggage, knuckles whitening. Flashbacks struck me like lightning. The sunlit kitchen, the cold silence, the long nights alone. Every ache, every tear, every quiet promise to myself that I would survive, all came rushing back with cruel intensity. And yet, beneath the anger and hurt, there was an almost absurd flicker of curiosity. After all these years, why now? Why them? Visual cues of their hesitance were etched into every gesture. The hesitant shuffle of feet, the way their eyes darted as if seeking reassurance from each other, the quick, almost involuntary glance at the private jet as if confirming it was real. I realized then that this encounter was more than a chance meeting. It was a confrontation without words, a collision of past and present. My chest tightened, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something I wasn't ready to name. Could I forgive them? Could I even face them? For a long moment, we simply stared. No one spoke. The world carried on around us, oblivious to the silent storm between three people whose lives had been split by years, distance, and unspoken truths. And in that pause, I understood the gravity of the moment. This wasn't a reunion, not yet. It was a test of what I had become, a mirror reflecting the resilience, anger, and empowerment I had spent decades cultivating. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was not the same child who had been abandoned. I was stronger, and I would not be defined by their return that we didn't speak. At least, not at first. The world around us continued. Its motion, the rumble of engines, footsteps on concrete, distant city noise. But in that small space, time seemed suspended. My parents' faces were a mixture of surprise, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. I could feel the tension, radiating off them, a fragile energy that mirrored the storm I had carried inside for decades. My hands tightened around my luggage, knuckles white, the leather cutting into my palms, grounding me in the present while my mind raced through every moment of the past, every lonely night, every silent tear, every wordless plea for them to care. I stared at them, and they stared at me, each of us measuring, weighing, trying to reconcile the passage of 20 years. Flashbacks hit me like shards of glass. I remembered my small hands clutching the edge of the sofa when they first left, the hollow sound of the door closing behind them, the ache of emptiness that never quite faded. And yet, here they were, flesh and blood, standing before me as if they had a right to re-enter my life. My chest felt tight, a storm of emotions fighting for space. Anger, disbelief, sorrow, even a strange flicker of something like longing. Visual cues told the story more clearly than words ever could. The slight tremor in my mother's hand, the way my father's gaze dropped briefly before snapping back, the faint quiver in their lips, as if they were unsure whether apology or explanation could bridge decades of silence. I realized in that instant that this confrontation wasn't about who was right or wrong anymore. It was about me, about the power I had earned, the strength I had forged, and the boundaries I had finally learned to set. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs, and let my eyes sweep over them one last time, memorizing their faces not as parents, but as the people who had abandoned me. No words passed, none were needed. The silence itself was a verdict, a declaration of independence I had honed over years of survival. And in that silent exchange, I felt a strange release, a clarity I had longed for. I could face them, acknowledge their existence, and still remain untouchable, untethered by the pain they had once inflicted. Finally, with the faintest flicker of resolve, I lifted my head, adjusted my bag, and stepped forward, not toward them, but into my own life. The confrontation was over, though nothing had been said, and I understood with absolute certainty that my past would not dictate my future. For the first time in 20 years, I felt entirely, irrevocably in control. That I made my choice quietly, but with absolute clarity. I didn't need to speak, didn't need to explain, and certainly didn't need their approval. My parents, after all, had already had their chance, and they had let it slip away decades ago. I lifted my bag, feeling its familiar weight, and stepped toward the jet, each footfall a small victory, a declaration that my life, my happiness, and my peace were mine to command. Behind me, I could feel their presence, hesitant, uncertain, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself a glance back, not for approval, not for reconciliation, but simply to acknowledge reality. Flashbacks drifted in, unbidden but gentle this time. I remembered the cold kitchens, the lonely nights, the countless times I had whispered to myself that I would survive. I remembered the small triumphs, the meals I cooked, the nights I studied, the work I poured myself into. And now all of it culminated in this moment, a choice not to let their return destabilize the life I had fought so hard to build. I had learned the weight of abandonment, and I had learned its lesson well. My worth was not defined by their presence or absence. It was forged in the quiet resilience of my own hands. Visual cues reinforced the gravity of my decision. The city lights reflected in the polished fuselage of the jet, the engines humming softly, waiting to lift me away. My reflection in the cabin window, calm and composed, contrasting sharply with the hesitation lingering in their faces, and the stretch of tarmac behind me, empty, symbolic of the distance I had always needed to create between my past and my present. I could feel the cool metal of the railing under my hands, solid and grounding, a tactile reminder of the life I had claimed for myself. That I didn't feel anger anymore, not in the raw, aching way I had as a child or a teenager. There was no need for revenge, no need for bitterness. I felt relief, a quiet, profound liberation that came from knowing I could set boundaries, that I could love myself enough to walk away from people who had failed me. That day, I realized that choosing myself wasn't selfish, it was survival, elevated to art. And as I took the final steps up the jet, leaving them behind, I felt a freedom I hadn't known existed. A life unchained from the expectations, the pain, and the absence of those who should have protected me. As the jet lifted off the tarmac, I sank into my seat and let the hum of the engines soothe the remnants of tension in my chest. The city below stretched out like a glittering map of my accomplishments, a testament to every choice, every struggle, every lonely night that had brought me here. The wind whispered against the windows, carrying with it a sense of closure I had chased for decades but never quite believed I would find. I realized, finally, that life wasn't about waiting for their approval or for the people who had abandoned me to recognize my worth. Life was about claiming it, step by step, moment by moment. Flashbacks surfaced gently, like waves rolling over smooth stones. I saw the sunlit kitchens of my childhood, the long silent nights alone, the small victories that had felt insignificant at the time but had quietly built the foundation of my resilience. And then I saw myself now, whole, strong, and unshaken. By the past, the pain remained, of course. It was part of who I had become, a reminder of what I had survived. But it no longer held power over me. It was a thread in the tapestry of my life, not the pattern that dictated it. Visual cues filled my mind as I looked out the window. The orange glow of the sunset brushing the horizon, the curve of the city lights fading into distance, the quiet luxury of the cabin surrounding me, all symbols of a life I had created entirely on my own terms. I felt the familiar weight of my hands in my lap, steady and unafraid, a tactile affirmation that I was the one steering my journey, and no one else held the right to redirect it. And in that serene moment, I understood something profound. The past, with all its abandonment, betrayal, and heartbreak, had taught me more than any love or comfort ever could. It had taught me resilience, self-worth, and the courage to choose myself. I smiled faintly, not out of joy or triumph, but out of quiet contentment, the kind that comes when you finally stop carrying the expectations of others and start living for yourself. Life was still unfolding, and that was enough that I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the hum of the engines carry me forward. The world was wide, and my place in it was secure. I had survived, I had thrived, and I was finally at peace. The past was a chapter, not the ending. And as the jet ascended higher, I knew that the story I had been waiting to live had only just begun.